I'm the program director of ACI and an adjunct professor of African Studies at the School for Foreign Service at Georgia University. For those of you who are new here, ACI aims to host virtual and in-person events that bring new empirical research on Africa-China engagements to our students and the wider public. Today, we're hosting a book event featuring China for Africa's Industrialization, authored by Carlos Oya. And it's part of the Elements of in Global China series, edited by Xinquan Li. Carlos is professor of political economy of development and head of the Department of Development Sciences at SOAS. He has three main research areas: political economy of development and economic transformation, agrarian change and development, and labor relations, global production, and labor markets. Carlos has done extensive field-based research on agrarian change and contemporary labor market dynamics in many African countries, including Ethiopia, Mozambique, Angola, and Senegal. He led a project on structural transformation and employment outcomes in infrastructure, construction, and manufacturing sectors in Ethiopia and Angola, with a special focus on Chinese firms and comparative employment outcomes. As you can probably gather, he's based in London. And the two discussants today are also joining us from London. Linda Calabresi is a senior research fellow at the International Economic Development Group at ODI, and Professor Arkabe Metiku Okube is currently the British Academy Global Professor in the Department of Development Studies, also at SOAS. He previously served as senior minister and special advisor to the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. Before I turn over to Carlos, just a couple housekeeping and other comments about the event. There was a slight error on the opening slide, and the Q&A will take us to 10:30. So the event runs until 10:30, not 10 o'clock. Carlos will present for about 25 minutes, and then each of our discussants will have about 10 minutes for their comments and questions. And then I'll allow Carlos a few minutes to respond to the discussants and then open up for questions from the audience. Audience members are welcome to type in your questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. You can do this at any time during the presentations. Please do not use the chat function for your questions. I'll select 3 or 4 questions for our first round, allow our panelists to respond, and time permitting, we'll take a few more questions until we wrap up at 10:30. Also, in case we lose some of you along the way, just a few words of appreciation. First of all, thank you so much to Brennan Young, the ACI program assistant who keeps all of our events and activities humming along. Thank you also to our event series co-sponsors, the Initiative for U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues, and especially Eleanor Albert, who helps us run these events. And then at Howard University, the Center for African Studies is our other co-sponsor. Finally, thank you to our institutional hosts, Asian Studies Program, and most of all, the African Studies Program and our director, Professor Lara Smith. With that, let me turn over to Carlos Oya. Carlos, look forward to hearing about your book.
Thank you very much, Yun. It's a real pleasure to be here online, virtually. Can you hear me well? Yes, good. Thank you very much for your invitation to present the book. I'm delighted also because this is the first formal presentation after the book was published back in November, and it is especially fitting that your university and also on behalf of the network have given me this opportunity. And I'm also grateful to both Linda and Arkebe for agreeing to join us. Their work has been inspirational in the past for the research underpinning the writing of this book, but also the many conversations I've had with them in the past have contributed to some of the thinking reflected in the writing of this book. So I'm really grateful for the presence in this discussion. So let me share my slides first. Please let me know if it's working well. Yeah. Okay. Let me go straight to the substance. So this is, I've got 25 minutes. I might need 30 minutes. If this is what I want to present, which is essentially the key building blocks of the book. This is a relatively short book, as all the elements in the series, but tries to tackle relatively big questions, which in itself is a challenge. So first, I'll say something about the aspirations and realities of industrialization in Africa. This is a very Africa-centered book. And I will say something about the key opportunities, but also obstacles that have emerged in its history. And then I will engage with the key question of the book, which is the extent to which growing Chinese engagements in African countries, especially in the last 25 years, have contributed to Africa's industrialization aspirations, in what ways, through what mechanisms. And as part of that, I will pay special attention to variation in outcomes, and particularly how agency and context matter. And that will be done particularly through the lens of a contrast between the two countries, which were the focus of our primary research in the project that Yoon just mentioned, therefore Angola and Ethiopia. There are a number of premises which are important to understand both the research underpinning this book, but also the book itself and its arguments. So this is not a book just about China and Africa. I mean, there's plenty of literature that takes this as the focus, but it is really about Africa's legitimate aspirations and right to development and structural transformation. And this is one of the things that really inspired me from the beginning. It is also about understanding the determinants of variation in outcomes across African countries. The book also rejects methodological nationalism along the lines of other scholars like Jin-Kwan Lee, but also Africa essentialism. And that partly explains the persistent focus on variation and the significance of domestic, national, and local contexts, which help us overcome and transcend the kinds of superficial narratives that unfortunately have also been present in some of the Africa-China literature of the past 20 years or so. And finally, in terms of the basis for the arguments of the book and the evidence, is a combination of extensive secondary research, taking advantage of the fact that, particularly in the last 7-8 years, there has been a flourishing literature, empirically grounded, granular literature in the Africa studies field, the Africa-China studies field, that has contributed plenty of relevant evidence to some of these questions. But also, it is several years of primary research, which we conducted across more than one project, at least 3 projects, which inform some of the evidence in this book. One of the key questions that the book tries to tackle, although quite briefly at the beginning of the element, is the why and how to industrialize, and particularly the why. And this might be a slightly counterintuitive question, because there seems to be a consensus that most countries have successfully developed through industrialization. That hasn't really changed. However, there is an ongoing debate, both in terms of whether industrialization is itself desirable, whether economic transformation, structural transformation cannot be achieved through other means, i.e., for example, through a service-led economy. And in fact, quite recently, Danny Roderick, a famous development economist, has made the bold argument that actually industrialization is no longer viable in most low and middle income countries, and therefore services will be the future for economic transformation. The book does, however, make a case for the relevance of industrialization, particularly for low income countries, and also provides a sort of very brief overview of the variety of trajectories of industrialization in contemporary capitalism and distinctions between the different drivers that led to industrialization at different periods of time. So it is true that the current contemporary dynamics is quite different from the kinds of configurations that countries like South Korea and other Asian industrializers faced in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But that does not mean that industrialization is no longer relevant for debates on economic transformation. So industrialization does matter for structural change, and the book makes an argument for that with reference to different sources of evidence. But it is clear that the how and for what purpose also matter as well. There are different possibilities there, and therefore that is part of the kinds of questions that we need to answer. The structural conditions that countries have, whether it's in terms of infrastructure, labor force, geography, resources, also matter, but they don't really always determine the pathways. And this is reflected in the book in the discussion of the different policy experiences of different African countries. So policy and agency matter, and this is where this book is also influenced by the work of well-known authors like Hirschman or Alice Amsden, which essentially put forward an argument against determinism and for a wider scope of industrial policy. Now, the reality of industrialization in Africa is not particularly rosy, as many know, but sometimes it has been oversimplified. There is a rich history of industrialization attempts across different African countries, but also significant debates about the viability of some of these attempts, both in the past but also in the contemporary period. So therefore, there are authors who have suggested that perhaps the early attempts of the 1960s and 70s were forms of premature industrialization, partly because the basic conditions, such as education, access to electricity, or savings, were not there. And there are also those who have argued that many African countries suffer from premature deindustrialization, in part because of the Washington Consensus policies, of the 1980s and 1990s, which led, indeed, in some cases, not everywhere, but did lead in some cases to reverse structural change, i.e. to the resurgence of primary commodity production as a driver of growth. There's also plenty of evidence of what some people call thin industrialization, i.e. there's some success, some pockets of industrial growth and development, but merely at the lower end of industrial networks for specific tasks within global production networks. So the reconfiguration of global production and manufacturing has also had an impact in terms of the possibilities and the windows of opportunity for new low-income countries industrializing. But what we see, particularly if we look at the last 20 years, is what I call contingent industrialization. There's actually quite a bit of variation, both across countries and over time, in terms of both the speed of new industrialization trajectories, but also the nature and the patterns of that industrialization. It is precisely that variety that calls for some more granular evidence on the possibilities and realities. So when we look at the aggregate statistics, the picture, as you can see here, is not particularly rosy, particularly if you use indicators such as manufacturing as value added. This is for the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. But there is clearly a turning point around the early 2000s where the value added in manufacturing production on a continental scale resurged. So there is clearly a turning point comparing the last 25 years with the previous 2 decades, where clearly there has been a revival both of industrial growth, but also industrial policy across different countries. However, that has happened, or this average masks a lot of variation. And this is what the next slide shows. So for example, if you look at the contrast between countries like Ethiopia and South Africa being the industrial manufacturing powerhouse in sub-Saharan Africa, and Ethiopia a newcomer, but in relative terms, their trajectories have been incredibly divergent, particularly when we look at the last 20 years. Sluggish industrial growth in the case of South Africa since the late 90s, and a phenomenal revival and growth in Ethiopia since especially 2010. And interestingly, the sort of a trend in Ethiopia in relative terms is actually not that different from 2 other success stories in Asia, Bangladesh and Vietnam, which are also illustrated in this chart. One particularity of the book, which is, of course, focused on questions of economic transformation and structural change through the lens of industrialization, is that it pays a lot of attention to labor. And in fact, there is an entire section of the elements that is devoted to discussing labor dynamics associated with the processes of industrialization in recent years. And the reason for that is, obviously, I am a labor scholar, as Ewan presented it at the beginning of the seminar, and therefore this is an issue that I've been researching for many years across different countries. But this is also relevant for debates about industrialization, because industrialization historically has also always been about social transformations. Whether you look at it from the perspective of development economics as a form of labor surplus transfer from agriculture to industry, or you look at it from the perspective of the rise of new work cultures, new skills that are learned, new forms of production, new labor processes. This is absolutely central to understanding both the nature of the industrialization process, but also the different kinds of outcomes. Some of them sometimes very positive and sometimes not so positive. And that's why there is also quite a lot of attention to questions of conflict, resistance, and struggles on the ground, which also partly explains sometimes the frictions that industrialization processes face in early stages. This is also important because many African countries face very, very significant employment challenges. There's a number of key stylized facts, such as widespread underemployment. Unemployment is not really the issue, but underemployment is. Low return, insecure employment, particularly informal labor relations, both in agriculture and outside agriculture. The youth bulge that many countries are experiencing without a demographic transition. The lack of prioritization of more and better jobs in policy making. Employment has been really absent from policy agendas for a very, very long time, certainly the 90s, 80s, 90s, and part of the 2000s. So it is important to center this analysis in labor issues. And in fact, much of the underpinning research for this book was centered on the employment dynamics associated with the arrival of Chinese firms to key sectors like infrastructure construction, as you can see in this picture. This is from our project, but also in manufacturing, especially in light labor-intensive manufacturing. So what are the key channels through which potentially, and in reality, growing Chinese engagements in different African countries may have contributed to lay the foundations for some industrial growth in a number of countries? And just to advance the key argument of the book is that indeed these rising engagements for the last 25 years have laid the foundations for potential industrial growth across a number of countries, have created a growing potential for industrialization across a number of countries, but with quite uneven and variable outcomes, i.e. these contributions really differ by context, and this is determined by the different policy agendas, capabilities, and policy implementation around the revival of industrial sectors. There is indeed a growing discourse of industrial cooperation that is increasingly seen in China-Africa engagements at the high policy level, something that has been particularly reflected since 2015. But this discourse of industrial cooperation, what is essentially doing is reflecting what is already happening on the ground, or what has been happening on the ground for the past 20 years. And these are some of the key vectors of potential contributions. So you have a very important contribution through infrastructure finance and building of that key infrastructure, notably energy, roads, industrial parks. The arrival of private industrial investors, a foreign direct investment that is essentially dedicated to manufacturing sectors, especially the kinds of manufacturing sectors that are more viable in low-income country contexts. These come with new jobs and new skills in both manufacturing and construction, which do create new employment dynamics that by themselves also create opportunities for future industrial growth. These investments also come with access to suitable and affordable technology that may be particularly conducive to the kind of industrial development that is possible in the current context in these countries. And finally, the presence of patient capital finance for manufacturing investments and for infrastructure that is conducive to manufacturing investment is also a very important element that is closely connected with infrastructure finance. So let me go through some of these vectors in a little more detail, but I will, for the sake of time, I will be fairly telegraphic in terms of some of these key elements. So the first effective mechanism is infrastructure finance and building. What we know from history is industrialization takeoffs are not possible without substantial but targeted infrastructure development. And there are three examples of infrastructure development that are particularly important. We know that from the history of early industrializers, but also late industrializers, and clearly also reflected in some of the experiences that we've seen in some African countries. First is power generation, so lower electricity costs and secure, reliable supply of electricity to factories is absolutely central. Any industrial investor would tell you that when talking about why they decided to invest in this or that country. The improvement in transport and logistics, especially for those who want to export, is absolutely crucial because lower transport costs are key for competitiveness in increasingly demanding and competitive global production networks. And finally, dedicated industrial hubs and parks, which ensure that agglomeration economies are achieved, that dedicated infrastructure is led to promote industrial growth, even in contexts where the infrastructure deficit is probably quite significant. But also in some cases, one could argue that these agglomerations may be conducive to better labor sourcing, a point I can maybe discuss during the debates later on. Patient finance and the flexibility with debt management has been critical in the last 20, 25 years, particularly for projects that targeted these key sectors. Finance has been linked to the vast expansion of Chinese contractors, mostly state-owned enterprises, with leading firms, which are all leading firms in the world of large-scale infrastructure, with the result of now more than 60% of the Africa's infrastructure markets, at least this is for 2019 data, being built by Chinese contractors compared to 10% only in 2003. So this sort of development finance that has been targeted for this key infrastructure development has certainly laid the foundations of potential industrial growth. Of course, this is not a sufficient condition, but in some cases, it certainly acts as a necessary condition. And what we know from the data on Chinese finance, particularly Chinese policy bank loans, is that a quite substantial proportion of these loans has actually been targeted to these key sectors, particularly energy and transportation. And that is more or less consistent across the board in most countries. But certainly those countries that have received the bulk of this finance have seen this kind of pattern of allocation. The third key element is, as I said before, Chinese manufacturing firms moving to African countries, i.e. exporting industrial capacity. And what we know about these is that these tend to be mostly private firms, many cases small, medium enterprises or family-run businesses. Obviously, from the Chinese context, scales and size really matter, and they're quite different in China compared to many African countries. And they tend to be the sort of forerunners of some of these increasing movements from Chinese, different varieties of Chinese capital, not only towards Africa, also to many other parts of the world, but to a number of African countries as well. When accounting for this phenomenon, the literature and our own research has shown a variety of motivations and drivers. In some cases, you can talk about overcapacity, profitability issues in China, rising wages, the incentives to go global, etc., etc. But also for many of these investors, the lure of African domestic markets, whether it's building materials, consumer goods, has acted as a major driver of investment. So we do have a combination of investments that are essentially domestic market oriented or market seeking, and in some cases, perhaps less dominant investments that are putting some African countries on the stage of global production networks, for which there is some scope for the kind of flying geese hypothesis that has underscored a lot of the industrial successes in Asia in the last 30, 40 years. So there is a growing emphasis on the idea of made in Africa and creating export platforms in some African countries away from Asia. So the stock of Chinese FDI to African countries has indeed grown very, very significantly, but as not surprisingly with the COVID pandemic and the upheavals of the last few years in geopolitical conditions, that process has stagnated a little bit. But between 2005 and 2019, there was clearly very, very substantial growth of that FDI. And when we look at it, not just in terms of value, but in terms of investment projects, the number of investors, manufacturing is a significant share and certainly much larger share of that FDI compared to other sources of FDI to Africa. We do see in this context, for example, in Ethiopia, the extent to which these investments generated quite substantial numbers of new industrial jobs, particularly concentrated in newly built industrial parks. The fourth key element that I wanted to highlight is policy. And and this is not just from the examples that we review in the book, but also from the lessons we have from the history, especially of late industrializers. So a coherent and ambitious industrial policy framework seems to be key to successful African agency in terms of leveraging the potential foundations that Chinese contributions have made to industrialization efforts. Now, for these industrial policy frameworks to emerge, what matters is that there is a conducive political settlement that allows for that framework to be politically viable. That means understanding the balance of power that helps manage the kinds of transition costs that are associated with industrial development and economic transformation. It does require bold industrial ambition that is not always politically viable, is not always present in all contexts. And this is something that is clearly illustrated through the contrast between Ethiopia and Angola. As part of that policy framework, but also the implementation of policy, another key element is the capacity to discipline the sources of finance and direct these different sources of finance, whether domestic or external, towards the key uses that will be most conducive to industrial development. Also, the capacity to target and discipline investors, the reciprocal control mechanisms that Ali Zamzan used to talk about with regards to the Asian experiences. But also the focus on achieving targets while avoiding a race to the bottom. This is the kind of peril, the kind of danger that many low-income countries have faced in their quest for industrialization. So we do that by contrasting the tales of industrial policy, the trajectories of industrial policy of Angola and Ethiopia over the last 10, 15 years. And this contrast is quite clear. Ethiopia is perhaps the outlier within the African continent in terms of the ambition of its approach, its vision, the combination of different mechanisms of import substitution industrialization, as well as export-oriented industrialization, something that was also quite common in previous experience of industrialization in Asia. Also, this idea of building verticality to attract global buyers and the top suppliers, the work towards coordinated infrastructure development through industrial hubs, which were properly serviced and meeting strict environmental standards, and various measures of investment promotion as well as labor mobilization to further tackle bottlenecks. What's interesting is Angola did none of this, and instead that basically let the market exploit emerging opportunities for import-induced demand. So whatever happened in Angola, something happened, wasn't because of a coherent and ambitious industrial policy framework in place. So the book goes into a lot of detail in terms of these differences, much more detail, particularly with regards to the Ethiopian history, which is particularly significant and illustrative of not only the positive outcomes that can be achieved through this sort of a coherent and bold approach, but also the kinds of obstacles and problems that are experienced along the way, which cannot be ignored. And as I said at the beginning, the book brings employment into the picture and then dedicates an entire section to the question of employment. And there's an illustration of the different kinds of subsectors, industrial subsectors, with different kinds of jobs that we've seen developing in countries like Ethiopia and Angola. Angola being slightly more similar, for example, to other countries like Nigeria. Different workforces, that's a very interesting contrast, with much larger presence of young migrant women, particularly in the textile and apparel sectors in Ethiopia, compared to a largely male workforce in Angola. Different dynamics of localization of the production workforce, but with generally shared challenges in what regards the localization of the managerial workforce, something that goes beyond Chinese firms. It's quite common across many foreign firms present in these countries. Labor turnover, labor conflict, absenteeism, work culture clashes, this is all documented in the book. And it's interesting, there's a whole discussion about to what extent these kinds of phenomena, which actually seem to surprise some investors, not only in Ethiopia, but also in other countries, were actually quite common in other early experiences of industrialization in other parts of the world, from early industrializers to late industrializers in Asia. migrant labor is a very important aspect of this process, as it has been in many other experiences of industrialization in the past. But there was quite a significant contrast between the predominance of more dormitory labor regimes emerging in Angola as opposed to Ethiopia, where these kinds of labor regimes were almost totally absent. In the case of Ethiopia, there is a complex politics of labor, which was particularly complicated by political dynamics since 2016 and that also led to the kinds of upheavals that we know happened from 2020 onwards. But clearly, there was much more intervention of the Ethiopian government on labor matters during that period than what we could see in Angola, where essentially what predominated with a sort of laissez-faire approach. So all these, both policy, but also the particularities of the sectors and the particular dynamics of investors in these countries also illustrate quite contrasting experiences of employment dynamics in these countries. So let me conclude with a couple of reflections, which essentially illustrate and summarize my experience of writing this book. So what this book does really is connecting, a number of key themes in the political economy of development. But particularly, what I'm interested in is in bringing production and employment back into these debates of structural transformations and the role of Africa-China relations in that process, but also to illustrate the centrality of the art of the possible, the fact that there is plenty of possibilities, there are windows of opportunities, against the kinds of over pessimistic accounts that unfortunately tend to predominate for people who talk about potentials for industrialization in Africa. So, as I said before, does therefore this so-called global China contribute to industrialization efforts in Africa? The answer is yes, but there is a lot of variation across countries. Yes, in terms of laying some of the foundations and creating some potential, but that potential can only be realized if a number of other mechanisms and conditions are in place. And the reality of many African countries is a variegated one in which not all countries, not all African governments are strongly pursuing industrialization, at least not pursuing industrialization with the kind of coherence and ambition that countries like Ethiopia did. And why is that? Because agency matters, politics matters. And it is not really about what a country has or what they receive from outsiders, but what they do with it. And with that, I can finish. Thank you very much.
Carlos, thank you so much for a very succinct presentation of the main tenets of your book. We really appreciate that. As soon as you stop sharing your screen, then I'm going to call on Professor Arkabe to provide his comments. And if you could see if you could limit them to about 10 to 12 minutes, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. First, let me congratulate Carlos for the publication of an excellent book on a timely issue. And the merit of this book derives on three important aspects. The first one is its methodological approach. A big part of the data has been based on primary research conducted for about 10 years in the field. And this makes the book different because many of the existing literature, quite significant, are not based on primary observation and primary research. So this has quite significant contribution. The second aspect that I find quite useful is the approach is not following the mainstream approach which we hear, which are quite dominant on the discussion in relation to China and Africa. And this book brings perspectives from development economics, from development studies, but in a different way, non-mainstream, alternative way. This makes the book quite relevant. Another aspect I want to emphasize the merit of this book is in combining the three perspectives which Carlos highlighted. First, the focus on industrialization is quite important because for the continent, which has lagged in terms of structural transformation, and demography is quite strong, with significant hundreds of millions of jobs to be created. Focusing on industrialization is quite important. If we look at the recent data on trade, the trade between China and Africa reached in 2025 $348 billion, an increase of 17% from year 2024. And from this, we find that 123 billion was export from Africa, while 225 billion was imports from China to Africa. So this major imbalance can only be addressed by industrialization, which will enable employment creation, which will enable also to expand exports and value addition, which also allows to add value to primary commodities. So industrialization is at the core of the economic transformation in the continent, and Carlos has effectively brought to the book. A third aspect is the labor economics, and in many of the literatures, the labor dimension is usually omitted and not used, even in the traditional sense. In terms of industrial policy literature, labor economics is usually not given much focus. So Carlos has brought in the labor dimension. So the 3 points make the book quite useful and also unique. I also would like to highlight the importance of building the analysis in terms of understanding the drivers of variation and evenness. First, we have to bear in mind we are talking about a continent with 54 countries, completely divergent countries. And it's impossible to capture by any research, and it's not possible also to homogenize African economy. And by looking, many of the literatures try to find commonalities and then give prescription, which is quite in line with the Washington consensus we know and the mainstream approach. And from the heterodox development economics perspective, understanding the unevenness, understanding the variation will allow us to understand the difference in the structure of political economy, the power dynamics, and also the drivers of growth. And this is also an important aspect that has been considered. And what we saw was in other related researches we have conducted on China, Africa, it shows that countries that were able to successfully build, even attract manufacturing firms, were those who have a strategic approach to China-Africa relations, as well as also pursuing an activist industrial policy. This was the case of Ethiopia. So Ethiopia targeted to attract mainly manufacturing FDI firms from China. And as the study by McKinsey showed in 2017, they found out that nearly 2/3 of firms that invested in Ethiopia were in manufacturing, while the continent average was about 30%. So these are quite important points. Having said this, I would like to raise important issues with relevance in terms of conducting research, and maybe Carlos may reflect on some of these points. These are not specific to the book, but these are the issues which I feel are key in the current situation of African structural transformation and also the China-Africa relations dynamics. First, we have to understand the China-Africa cooperation in an institutionalized way started mainly in year 2000. So which means it's 25 years of FOCAC experience. And the growth has been quite impressive. As Carlos said, financing had increased nearly 200 billion and investment nearing almost 50 billion. and also trade volume, as I indicated, 348 billion. This is quite significant because in year 2000, it was only 10 billion if we look at the trade volume in that year. And at that time, China GDP per capita was only 1,000, actually below 1,000. And the size of the economy was 1.2 trillion. Now, things have changed after 25 years. China has now, its GDP is over $20 trillion. And it's also not an emerging economy, but in many ways a global powerhouse, economic powerhouse, emerging in technology and also undoubtedly in manufacturing and also in terms of trade. So given the advances we have come and also Africa's demography, in year 2000, it was only 800 million. Now the continent is 1.6 billion in 2026, twice. And this is going to be, demography is going to be a key element in Africa. So some of the key issues would be, given the journey we have gone through, and that there are the structure of global economy and also division of labor is changing. One important element will be to look at how these demographic trends, the technological advances also, which are unleashing now, and also the shift in the global division of labor, how it's going to change the China-Africa and how Africa will be able to tap as a driver of industrialization is going to be an important research area with practical relevance to the continent. The second dimension probably that will be useful is the issue of multilateralism. We are now living in a different evolving global order. The major trend will not change. For instance, one of the key shift in the global order is the rise of global south. It's not going to change despite the ongoing tariff measures or the geopolitical tension. It's a major long-term trend. But as we see attacks on multilateralism and the global order is shifting, and China is now at the center of this element, playing a positive role. That's my opinion, my personal opinion. And in the view of the global south ascendancy, then we have to see how this will shape the Africa's position in terms of tapping industrialization. So I feel these two are important questions, but we cannot answer it also by looking at Africa as a continent, because the continent is diverse. When we look at tariff, for instance, effect of the new tariff levied in 2025, the most hit country was Lesotho, and then which was relying on textile. And from all industries, the one that was most affected was textile and apparel industry, which is a major driver of employment. The least affected were fossil fuel exports from the continent. So we need to understand this. One additional element I haven't mentioned is the issue of green technology and green industry. One of the biggest, I would say, contribution or gift of China in the last 25 years is the progress made in terms of ensuring renewable energy becomes a mainstream source of energy, where costs have reduced over 90% in the last 15 years, and that renewable energy has become now as a major solution in many African countries. But we need to see, because the climate change effect is also, the continent, Africa, is the one that is the most vulnerable to climate change. So we have to link it with the digital transformation now, with the greening and rising of emerging economies, and how the industrialization cannot be isolated from building carbon neutral or green industrialization in the continent. Thank you very much. And again, I congratulate Carlos for an excellent scholarly contribution.
Thank you, Arkabe.
Thank you so much, Arkabe. And some comments from Linda Calabresi from ODI.
Of course. Thank you very much. And really a pleasure to be here. I also want to use this opportunity to extend my congratulations to Carlos for the excellent book. Anything that has to do with China these days, and including, discussions on Africa, China, is full of geopolitical hyperbole, right? China is either the neo-colonial villain or is the champion of win-win, right? It's either very good or very bad. And I think the book really helps moving away from this Manichaean view of the world and actually brings a lot of rigorous evidence and empirical evidence into the discussion, into the narrative, which is something that both, the development community, the scholars, but also the policymakers really need at the moment. I really like that the book moves away from the sort of very high level rhetoric, and it looks at the politics of production. It looks at what happens in the factories and the working conditions. It really provides a lot of details and a good roadmap to show how structural transformation can happen. The book takes an Africa-wide perspective, but then Carlos has looked a lot in detail into the cases of Ethiopia and of Angola. And I would like to reflect a bit on those in view of, or maybe actually I would like to use those experiences to reflect on the work that I do. My work bridges research and policy and focuses on East African countries that are not as committed to the industrial development agenda as Ethiopia, and maybe are not so laissez-faire as is Angola. So somewhere in the middle, but are also countries such as Uganda or Rwanda, for example, which haven't received so much Chinese investment compared to both Ethiopia and Angola. They are kind of second-tier, sort of middle countries in that sense, smaller economies with a lot less attention from the big players, receive a lot of less attention from the big players, and have this interest in, industrializing, but maybe they're not so politically committed to this agenda. So let me, use the book and reflect a bit on that. So the first thing that I really like about the book is that it brings back industrialization. Now Carlo has, presented the fact that industrialization is something that has gone in and out of fashion in the development community and among policymakers. My sense is that at this particular time in history, it's actually out of fashion again. It was very popular at the end of the last decade, and even the IMF wrote that industrialization is good and we all need it, and developing countries need it. But at this particular moment in time, I feel the interest is dwindling and it's actually fading quite a bit. And this makes it very difficult for countries to actually maintain that commitment, because unless you are a country like Ethiopia that really had that agenda at the forefront, anyone else is addressing a lot of different priorities at the same time. Of course, the governments are interested in industrializing, but they also see that agriculture is very important because it's the sector where most of the people work and that feeds most people in the country. Services is also important because, everyone tells you that services are the future in a way. And then you have the advisors, the sort of the development community that tells the government that you have to maintain a level play field and you must not pick winners, right? So whichever investment you have is good, actually. You don't have to really direct it so much towards a specific sector. And I think the book demonstrates very well that in the industrial sector, that manufacturing is a very specific activity that really has a lot of positive impact on the rest of the economy and should be pursued for countries that want to achieve that want to increase their income levels. But what model of manufacturing is to be chosen? And Carlos really hinted at that. And the fact that the Asian tigers first, and China also more recently, follow this export-led industrialization model where things were imported, processed, and then re-exported, and then growing from that and building the complexity of the economy from that. And this is really a model that has been recommended to many African countries. But what we see, and we see a lot of that, is that there's also a different model, which is, and Carlo mentioned, is the production for the domestic sector, for the domestic market. So what we see is that a lot of Chinese companies in countries like Ethiopia, but also Lesotho, or countries with very strong sort of export orientation, the Chinese companies invest and really invest in that sector and help countries boost their exports. And that's great. But in a lot of other countries, what's actually happening is that the Chinese companies invest and produce things that are needed in the domestic market. It can be construction materials, it can be fast-moving consumer goods, it can be any sorts of items that people really use. And in a way, African countries are sheltered by what is considered to be their weakness potential. High transport costs, for example, is also something that shelters the market from external competition. And the tariffs that African governments charge on imports is also something that helps the country, that attracts investment into the country and attracts production into the country. So that sort of domestic production, that model of producing for the internal market, is something that a lot of African countries are, I think, using quite successfully to strengthen their manufacturing sector. So this was overall on manufacturing. And then if we look particularly at China, the book really does a very good job at explaining all the different channels through which China contributes to industrialization. And the first one that was mentioned was the capital in infrastructure, the so-called patient capital. This capital that comes in, finances infrastructure, and doesn't need an immediate return. It can be there for a few years. It can finance these long-term projects that reduce the bottlenecks that affect Africa's industrialization, energy, transport costs, and so on and so forth. Everything is sort of supported by this patient capital. Now, this is also something where we need to reflect a little bit, because there's this narrative that, this era of Chinese patient capital in Africa is or anywhere actually is ending, that we see a lot less finance going towards these infrastructure projects. And we need to wonder what that means for the African countries that receive this finance and that have used this to strengthen their infrastructure and to really build on that infrastructure industrialization link. I'm not in the pessimist camp, and I don't think that it's the end of lending for infrastructure, but I just think that the sources are shifting and changing, and that may mean that the model is becoming slightly different. And then we see this patient capital deployed not only in infrastructure, but also in manufacturing. Now, this is generally not termed patient capital. Like the companies that invest in manufacturing are not generally considered to be patient capital, but in many ways they are. In many ways, the companies invest and take a risk in a reality that's very different from what they know. African countries are very different from China. They're willing to incur a loss. They're willing to wait a few years before they see profits. And they're willing to, try and do something that companies from other parts of the world are not. This is not unique to China, by the way. This is also, we see Indian companies. In countries like Uganda, we see Kenyan companies or South African companies as well. So definitely emerging market companies are the ones that are more willing to take this risk compared to companies from other parts of the world. But it's not always the case. I have a friend who's an entrepreneur in an East African country. They're very successful entrepreneur in different sectors, real estate, forestry, agriculture, services, tourism, and so on. And then I asked them, why don't they invest in manufacturing? Why don't they, set up an activity like that? And they told me it's too difficult. You have to consider that you have to make sure that everything runs smoothly. You have to make sure that the machines are working, that electricity is there. Whereas if you just build a building and then rent out the flats, that's just a lot easier. You don't have to be there all the time. You don't have to, wait for many years to see the profit materialize. And this is where the Chinese patient capital is actually very instrumental, not only in financing the infrastructure, but also in the investment itself. Let me just, I think there's a lot that could be said in a number of areas. The book talks a lot, and maybe it wasn't discussed so much in the presentation, but the book talks a lot about the role of knowledge transfers and spillovers between Chinese companies and African companies, about the role of managerial competencies that exist. So I think these are all topics that it would be very interesting to explore a bit better. But for now, maybe let me just, raise a couple of questions to Carlos, since I have the opportunity, that I think maybe can help us all reflect on the content of the book. The first question is, given the pivotal role of African governments in the process, you have really emphasized the importance of the political settlement and the policy commitments towards industrialization and the agency that African countries have in the process. I wonder if it actually makes sense to talk about China at all. We also know that it's not just China, right? It's companies from many other countries investing in African manufacturing, from North Africa, from the Gulf, from India, and so on and so forth. So does it make sense to focus on China? Shouldn't we actually just be looking at African countries and foreign capital and how they make the best use of foreign capital for their industrialization? Sorry. And then the second question is about the future, and is about the role of new technologies. So I'm not, I'm not in the panicky camp. I don't think that, new technologies will mean that everything is automated and no more manufacturing will go to Africa. I don't think that's the case. I think there was this panic a few years ago, and we have seen that that's not the case at all, actually. But I think we also need to reflect on what the new technology, the automation, means in a place like China, where automation is actually helping retain not only the very high level, very productive type of manufacturing, but also the sort of the lower segment, the textile and garment, that's being, for example, rearranged and rationalized using digital platforms, for example, right? So it feels like it may be that opportunities that were available when China industrialized are less present at the moment. So what do African governments, in your view, need to do to adjust to, well, first of all, do they need to adjust to these changes or not? And if so, what do they need to do? What is that they need to take into account to make sure that, in the future, the window of opportunity remains open for African countries? I'll stop there, but thank you very much for the opportunity, and congratulations again, Carlos, on the book.
Thank you, Linda.
Linda, thank you so much. Carlos, let me go ahead and turn back to you to respond to the two discussants' comments and some of their questions. And if I could just take advantage of my position and tack on a couple of things that I thought of as particularly as Linda was speaking. I was thinking about the Chinese factories in West Africa that existed kind of prior to this kind of latest push towards kind of greater investment in industrialization. And from what I've read, they seem to produce not only for local markets specifically, but for regional markets. That's given the populations of Nigeria, and the proximity of Ghana to regional kind of markets, that's been a big kind of advantage for them, and whether or not that's a possibility for other regions as well. Then again, as Linda was speaking about some of the examples, I think I've been doing some work with the size carry survey data that was linked to your own research, and looking at 150 different manufacturing kind of projects. And one of the things that was very clear to me is, like you mentioned, so much of the investment in manufacturing is private. private sector. But a lot of it is also, in addition to being private, is Chinese migrant investment. So it would never count as foreign direct investment. It's investment of Chinese people who went to Africa for perhaps some other reason, right? Whether to work in another factory or to work on a construction project, but then they stayed. And kind of leads me to kind of one of Linda's last points about, how we define patient capital or slow capital. And in some ways, to me, this is a lot of Chinese migrant investment in Africa. They've been there now for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, right? And they're staying and they're finding different opportunities, whether it's in industrial, a small factory or in property development or mining activities. It strikes me that is a large component of what you're talking about, particularly in manufacturing. So let me just leave it at that and turn back to you to respond. And then we should have time to pick up a few of the questions.
Thank you very much, Yoon, for your last questions, but also the very kind comments from my friends Arkebe and Linda. Very, very insightful and indeed very much at the heart of the argument that I try to articulate in the book. And I mean, many of the questions you've raised, particularly on the current geopolitical economic environment and the implications for African countries and the quest to industrialize, are questions that I'm also asking myself, and questions that are perhaps slightly difficult to answer at this point because everything seems to be moving so fast. I think Arkebe raises very important points, especially on trade patterns. It's quite clear that, and perhaps this is one of the areas that I didn't really explore in the book, how trade patterns shape the possibilities for industrialization in African countries between, China and African countries. The fact that, these trade patterns have been very often seen as essentially as a reproduction of the old patterns where African countries export primary commodities to China and then import growing quantities of manufactured products. But I think even that is potentially changing, and that raises a question that I ask myself as well, that the fast pace of change in China, as described by Arkebe, in terms of technological advancement and, and economic growth, but also the change in the economic model of the country, is also coming with a change in society. Society in China is also changing really, really fast. And China is becoming potentially a massive market. And of course, a very large of that market will be served by, the growing production capacities of China itself. But my argument is also that potentially a significant and a growing share of that Chinese market will also have to be served by other countries of the global south. And that's why the point that Arkebe made on the rise of the global south, the rise of the global south is there to stay, is going to be, part of the new story that is going to determine the windows of opportunities for many African countries with regards to what kinds of production lines they can aspire to develop, what kinds of sector dynamics they can promote, what kinds of opportunities they can reap. And that relates to your question, Yoon, in the sense that indeed regional markets will become important parts of the picture. Particularly when you look at West Africa is increasingly being integrated. And this is not necessarily because of grand initiatives like the Africa-wide Continental Free Trade Act. I mean, that hopefully or potentially can lead to some outcomes. But this is dynamics that is ongoing on the ground anyway, regardless of this openness of African countries to other African countries. And if that expands and the sort of development of regional markets consolidates, that is certainly going to create additional possibilities for industrial growth that were not present at the start. And indeed, what the book illustrates is, as Linda suggested, is this interesting dynamic between, those who are domestically oriented, market seeking in national markets, those who are oriented towards export. And very often when we think about those who are exporting, we immediately think about their US, European export markets and so on. But we don't really think about the potential for exports to the region, but also the potential for exports to other parts of the global south, whether it's China, India, or countries in Latin America for that matter. So in that sense, I'm not so pessimistic. I think the pace of change is such that that is creating further opportunities. I'm also not so pessimistic because of what Arkebe mentioned with regards to the development of green technology as part of the green transition in China. That is opening up opportunities which were not really uh, seen 20 years ago. I mean, if you ask anyone 20 years ago about the possibility of any African countries producing solar panels or wind turbines or any kinds of goods for the green transition, people would have laughed. And I think that's actually something that may be feasible for a number of countries. And indeed, it is already happening, not just in Africa, but also in Latin America and in parts of Asia, where you do see Chinese companies aggressively pushing for the exporting of production capability to these areas. Electric vehicle production, for example, that's an area that was not planned or expected 15, 20 years ago. And that is going to become a major source of industrial growth. So the question really remains on, okay, these windows of opportunities will open. There will be other windows of opportunities that may close. I don't know to what extent more and more countries will be able to expand their production of textile and apparel, for example. That may be slightly less, the prospect may be slightly less rosy in the coming 10, 20 years. So to the point of technology and sort of pessimistic accounts, and the pessimistic account tends to say, look at what's happening in China. There are now entire factories that are fully automated. They can pretty much produce almost anything without workers. That is true. I mean, there are examples of such factories, but this is a little bit of one of those things that come up in the media, and then suddenly everyone thinks that there's no workers anymore in factories in China, which is not obviously is not true. It is true that automation has proceeded really, really fast in China, and that can have implications for industrialization opportunities in other parts of the global south. But I think that's also exaggerated. I mean, the conditions for automation in China are not the same as in other countries. There may be investors who don't have the capacity or the interest, and indeed it wouldn't be profitable for them to invest in automation in, I don't know, factories in Uganda or Tanzania. Whereas in China, for certain segments of production, this is not only possible and viable, but also desirable, partly because of the growing labor shortages that the industrial sector in China is facing, in a context where at the moment migration or immigration is not seen as a solution to those labor shortages in China. So I think as it happens with the long history of capitalism, we've always had these sort of threats, whenever there's a big technological advancement, and oh my God, this is just going to close any opportunity for employment creation in these sectors. And then suddenly something else happens that increases manufacturing employment and other employment opportunities. But I think coming back to one of the points made by Arkebe, yeah, the demographic trends speak for themselves, and the fact that population growth in most of Africa is so rapid means that the employment challenge is only going to increase. And therefore, my argument is not that all the hopes are in industrialization. Of course, I know that actually most of the jobs that will be created in the coming 2 decades in most African countries will be service jobs. But that doesn't mean that industrialization will not be central to those developments. And of course, migration will also be part of the story. There's no way that those demographic trends in Africa will not be linked to migration patterns, shifting migration patterns on a global scale, and not on the scale that we see at the moment. So on the future of technology, as going back to a question from Linda, no, I'm not panicking. I'm not panicking yet. I think that's quite specific to specific sectors, but also that technological progress also opens new opportunities and creates new lines of production that can potentially create spaces for industrialization in other parts of the world. That going back to the first of Linda's questions, all that, all these global dynamics and the impact of what happens outside is not as important as what happens inside. And that's why, centering all this analysis in politics and what's happened with domestic politics is absolutely central. Understanding, for example, why, in the example that Linda gave, why a successful entrepreneur in these East African countries is only considering, low risk, quick return activities as opposed to manufacturing. That is a question that policymakers really have to take seriously. And if they take the long-term development of the country seriously. If the sort of same kind of dynamic of reproduction of local domestic capital is maintained, clearly these will be the sectors that will grow and produce some jobs, not necessarily the best kinds of jobs. And those kinds of investment dynamics are likely to be conducive to sufficiently sustain economic transformation. So that's why a proactive intervention of the state, which is something that Arkebe agrees with, is absolutely necessary. The state actually needs to direct these entrepreneurs, and the state needs to reduce the risk that these entrepreneurs are facing so that they can be lured towards these investments. And I think, just to finish, some of the examples we've seen in our research and some of the examples that Linda has given of very resilient Chinese investors, some of the examples that you've given on these Chinese migrants, which, by the way, yes, they are not accounted as foreign direct investment, but we did in our research, clearly. But these Chinese diaspora, one of the most striking features is their resilience. Just to give you a snippet of evidence, a few months ago, I tried to get some updated numbers on what's happening in some of the industrial parks in Ethiopia, and Arkebe hopefully will agree with me on that. And what I found out is actually the Eastern Industrial Zone, one of the most famous Chinese industrial parks in the country, have seen an increase in the number of firms in the park over the last 5 to 6 years, something that nobody would have expected 4 years ago. So clearly, there's something about the resilience of that capital, those investors who put a lot of their capital in those factories, etc. And despite, against the odds, they just staying there and diversifying into other activities. And they're not planning to go back to China. Not least because, as you say, Yoon, these are Chinese diaspora. They're there to stay. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Arkebe, you said you had a comment you wanted to add to this conversation before I open up. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I saw one of the questions was why on the Q&A I saw that why Chinese FDI, why not from other countries? I want to explain one key aspect. For me, the discussion we are having is not actually about choosing Chinese companies. It's not the issue. The issue is for accelerated industrialization to happen in the continent, African countries should be able to attract productive investment to the continent, especially that helps to speed up industrialization. So this applies to many countries. If we look in Morocco, Morocco is one of the countries doing superb in automotive. It has primarily focused on European manufacturers, and the country now exports $8 to $9 billion vehicles to Europe, and 90% are exported to Europe. When we also look other countries, Turkey is one of the countries investing in many African countries, including in Ethiopia. Indian companies take risk, and they are very active in many African countries. And when we look at Asia in some sectors, we see companies coming in textile and apparel from Bangladesh, from Indonesia, from Sri Lanka, from of course, from Hong Kong-based companies as well. So it's with different origins, but the key is how can African countries, these companies who are looking new opportunities, how can they create the required support environment so that they can come and invest And the most important aspect of productive FDI is two elements. One is in the export sector. If the government's policy is to primarily focus to guide them where they can export, because the domestic import substitution could be left for locals to be to play an active role, that could really help. And the second benefit is know-how transfer. So it's not talking about, I mean, the discussion is not about choosing China. China is quite unique because we are talking about world's manufacturing powerhouse. We have also to remember the tide has also changed. Now the US is talking about manufacturing, Europe is talking about manufacturing, every country is talking about manufacturing. Also, the high-tech element, AI, is coming to the forefront because it's also linked with manufacturing. So even in Ethiopian context, what we know is in some sectors, it's entirely dominated by companies coming from other countries. In brewery, 100% of the whole industry, which is the fastest growing sector in Africa, which is in Ethiopia, is dominated by European breweries, brewing companies, all the well-known brands. So in floriculture, it's essentially the Dutch who have extensively invested. So a key element is how can Africa use to attract productive investment? And it doesn't kill the domestic farmers. It actually helps to create more jobs, to improve management capability, as it has been proven by many researchers. And the Chinese are also, as many research shows, they are also good at developing the skills. They want local management team as well because it's cheaper for them to use local companies. So we need to bear this in mind. Then I also want to add the message, for instance, that import-export imbalance we see between China and Africa is because it's linked with industrialization. It's not because of restriction from China's side. It's mainly linked with the inability to develop productive capacity on the African side, and even the inability to boost agricultural exports as well, even with no value addition. And we know that in 2025, and of course before that also 2024, African exporters can import to China duty-free without paying any import duty. It's zero, even if it's automotive or any other products. So the opportunity is there, and a key factor here is what also Carlos mentioned, is African governments should be obsessed, should be single-minded, focused on industrialization. And when we talk about industrialization, we are not talking only about manufacturing. We are also talking about other priority sectors with backward linkage to mining, to agriculture, and also services sector. So the key element is that we need to focus on diversifying the economy and developing industrialization.
Thanks, Arkabi. Actually, Carlos, I wanted to kind of restate the sentence because it connects up with one of Linda's points, which I don't think you got to. But the question is, again, is from Jaylin Pang, and she said, why is China more suited for foreign direct investment and driving industrialization in Africa more than other economic powerhouses? And Arkabi did provide a really substantive answer regarding Ethiopia in particular. I wonder if you have any further comments because Linda stated it quite differently, but she said, why should we focus on China as, rather than broader foreign investment in Africa and in your case,
Yeah.
particularly in industrialization? So
Yeah.
maybe we can just have you respond to that. And then there's one more
Sure.
question.
Yeah. So of course, I mean, first, it is not entirely surprising that, China has features, as Arkabi also say, in the case of Ethiopia, but also in other cases, quite substantial proportions of their FDI were to go into manufacturing. And that requires an understanding of previous patterns of FDI to African countries prior to these re-emergence in the last 2 decades. And the previous patterns, when you look at the statistics, were always that by and large, more than 80–90% of foreign direct investment was going to resource extraction, essentially, particularly to the fossil fuel industry, the extractive sector, and so on. And that is usually coming from countries or companies from the global north. And in some cases, more or less following the kind of old colonial patterns, French companies investing in some West African countries, British companies in some East African, Southern African countries. Now, that has been reversed partly because the kinds of investments that can come from China, but also from other countries of the global south, are unlikely to completely reproduce this phenomenon. Of course, there's also Chinese firms and firms from other parts of this global south that invest in resource extraction. Let's not ignore that. That is also happening, or also investing in the service sectors like, in finance, right? But it's quite clear that there is a kind of, comparative advantage, let's say, of companies from these other countries. That means that more industrial investors are likely to take the kinds of risks they're going to find in East African, West African, Southern African markets. But as Arkebe said, absolutely, that's the case. It's not just Chinese firms. You have a growing number of firms from other parts of Asia, and particularly in sectors like textile and apparel. You see that these other countries, especially in Southeast Asia, or Bangladesh is another potential source of investment. We're going to see more and more of these investments. Turkey is also featured quite prominently in these kinds of investments. So the more industrialization expands across the global south in middle-income countries, the more you're likely to have this kind of effect of companies basically relocating to spaces where they have the necessary infrastructure, but also some of the employment advantages, the labor cost advantages that you can see potentially in African countries. But I think, as Arkebe was saying, ideally, with governments that are really ambitious and single focused on industrialization, a key priority, I would say there's a couple of priorities that would need to be taken into account. One is that if there is capital from abroad interested in developing manufacturing capabilities, that these should be directed as much as possible towards exports, precisely because they potentially have the know-how, the kind of experience, international experience that is missing in domestic production capabilities. But the second kind of priority, and that also speaks to some of the other questions that have been raised in this forum, is how to develop domestic industrial ecosystems that tap into the opportunities of connections and linkages with these other investments. How to nurture domestic entrepreneurs, domestic capital to become suppliers or to be part of supply chains of these new investors coming from abroad and to develop these sectors. That is going to be critical because it's historically, when you see success stories of fast and sustained industrial development, the role of domestic capital is always there. And that cannot be circumvented. And it's not just a matter of division of labor. Let the foreign investors deal with export markets and our domestic investors deal with domestic markets. It's actually getting both linked together and making sure that eventually also domestic investors, as in Bangladesh, become global exporters. And that would be really the kind of ultimate goal.
Thanks, Carlos. Just one more question. And again, I think you've already started to answer some of this, but Tamara Ba, who says hello and congratulations, a former SOAS alumni, says, building on your research on Africa's industrialization, I was wondering how, if at all, you see climate considerations shaping these trajectories today, right? We talked about that a little bit, but
Yeah.
as many African countries pursue green industrialization to drive economic growth, LFP and climate socioeconomic resilience, what role do you see China playing and where do you see key opportunities and gaps?
Yeah.
So if you could tackle
Well,
that
I mean, the first thing I
briefly.
would say is to Tamara, hi Tamara, is read Arkebe's work. I mean, he's been working a lot on these questions of green industrialization and green transitions and implications for economic transformations in Africa. This is indeed, in my view, a very, very significant opportunity. And China is central precisely because they are at the forefront of the technologies, the goods that are absolutely central to green industrialization, whether it's the production of electric vehicles or production of the kinds of things that you need to produce renewables, that has become central and will continue to be central. So the key issue is that the opportunities are going to be there. I think that is, the Moroccan example is very good. Morocco is moving in that direction, not just in the export of electric vehicles, but also in solar, the expansion of solar farms and renewable energy, partly also in connection with Chinese investments, although not only Chinese investments. This is also and which is why we need to pay attention to other sorts of investment. Morocco has very strong linkages with Europe and particularly with Spain. And the renewable industry has become an incredibly dynamic industry that is going to expand globally. So yeah, I do see the future of industrialization in a growing number of African countries in the green industrialization space, not least because many African countries have incredible potential for the production of renewable energy. Ethiopia is a very good example of that, but there are many, many other African countries where there is hydropower, solar, wind energy. These could potentially become the main sources of energy. And I think this is an important point. I'll finish with this, because when we talk about the green transition, sometimes I think we need to go back and look at the data. So far, when you look at the global energy production and use, what's happened is not really a replacement, a substitution between renewables and fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. What's happened is that they've been growing all at the same time. Coal is still growing, as a source of energy on a global scale. And I think there is a real opportunity, particularly in Africa, for that substitution to actually take place. Of course, fossil fuel use is also likely to rise as African countries develop, and especially as they industrialize. They will need these sort of sources of dirty energy. But the key is that the other sources of energy grow much, much faster. I think if there is one continent when this is feasible, that is Africa.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Thank you especially for sharing your book with us as a kind of premiere event for the launch of your book.
Which, if I may, Yun, just for the audience, is open access. So, of course, you can buy it. I'm not telling you not to buy it, but there's a very quick way of getting access to the book, which is just going to the Cambridge University Press link and just download the PDF.
Amazing, amazing. I would also encourage just, for us as authors and scholars, if you can afford to buy the book or recommend it to your institutional libraries, please have them do that. But the fact that it's open access is amazing. Thank you also to our two fantastic discussants who are clearly very knowledgeable and added so much depth and breadth to the event. We have two more event webinars coming up. On Friday, 27th of February, we're going to be presenting a third and final in our USIP series featuring early career African scholars. And on deck for this next one, we have Shannon Arnold and Keenan Govinder discussing their research on enhanced South Africa-China military cooperation on South Africa's peace and security objectives in Africa. The following month, also Friday, 27th of March, we're going to have another book event featuring Emeka Umeji's forthcoming book, China in African Media, Between Influence Operations and Decolonialization. And for those of you who are in the Washington, D.C. area, we're going to be hosting our in-person spring symposium on the 23rd of April on Chinese infrastructure projects in the Global South, featuring research on China's Global Development Initiative, Belt and Road Initiative, as well as small but beautiful projects, Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. So I hope you'll be able to join us. You'll receive further information on all of these, but for now, please mark your calendars, and we look forward to seeing all of you again at the next event. Again, thank you so much, Carlos, Arquebe, and Linda.